The city of Portland is a place many would like to call their home. There's a reason that Portland ranks pretty high on the list of the United States' most livable cities. Within an hour drive of the ocean and as much to the nearest mountains, Portlanders have a plethora of opportunities to spend quality time. Even if they stay in town, Portland offers much to its citizens. There are almost 300 parks in the city, hundreds of bars and restaurants, and a ton of opportunities to have fun. The city also has a lively arts scene and cherishes the easygoing culture of living. However, behind the facade of a gorgeous city lies the memory of one of the darkest chapters in Portland's history. The story of a town that disappeared in a day is one that most Portlanders would like to forget. Unfortunately, most of them probably don't know a thing about an event that happened just 70 years ago. Only in the case that one wanders off to the western part of Delta Park, there's a chance they will stumble upon information. A sign about Vanport wetlands. Just one sentence of the information mentions the Vanport flood that destroyed many homes in the area called Vanport City, which included World War II period housing and schools. On the side of Portland International Raceway tracks and Heron Lake Golf Club, there once was the second largest city in Oregon, the City of Vanport. Not only was it the largest city in the state after Portland, but it was also one of the rare settlements where blacks were allowed to live. The story of the 1948 flood that wiped Vanport from the face of the earth is a reminder of Oregon's shameful past. The roots of these issues in Portland and Oregon are deep and date back to the very beginning of the state's history. Today, blacks comprise barely 2% of the entire Oregon population, far below the national average. Not a surprise, considering the fact that when Oregon joined the United States in 1859, its constitution explicitly forbade black people from working, owning property, and even living in the state. Over time, emancipation found no way into the state on the West Coast. Instead, Oregon became a haven for Southerners running away after the Civil War. In the early 20th century, Oregon was a white supremacist hotbed with over 14,000 Ku Klux Klan members. More importantly, racist policies were often advanced by the state. The only blacks allowed to live in Oregon were railroad workers, an exception made only due to the lack of white labor willing to do the work. The first sign of emancipation in Oregon occurred only in 1927, when the law prohibiting blacks from voting was revoked. From that point on, the black population in Oregon began rising. But it still comprised a tiny percentage of the entire population. In the late 1930s, Portland had less than 2,000 black inhabitants, most of them living in the Albina district of the city. That 2-square-mile large community was the only place blacks were allowed to live within Portland city limits. The unofficial policy of redlining prohibited all minorities from purchasing property outside labeled areas. The situation changed with the outbreak of World War II. The increasing demand for war vessels caused the rise of the shipbuilding industry on the West Coast. One of the industrialists, Henry Kaiser, built a shipyard in Portland. In the first years of the war, Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation made huge profits, working primarily for the British government. Most of the employees were white, but the situation changed once the United States entered the war in December 1941. Because of discriminatory attitudes in the military, blacks could generally not enlist in the Army or the Navy. White Oregonians who were drafted now had to be replaced with a black workforce. Since the black population in Portland was minuscule, many people from all over the United States arrived in Portland looking for jobs. Black newcomers filled in the gap caused by the lack of labor in Kaiser's shipyard, but at the same time raised the issue of their residence. The Housing Authority of Portland was facing a problem because redlined areas designated for blacks were overcrowded. The temporary housing units they provided were insufficient for the number of black workers that kept pouring in. Finally, Henry Kaiser solved the problem by forming a settlement with over 10,000 housing units in marshlands between the Columbia River and Columbia Slough. Village construction started in August 1942 and was finished in only 110 days. It was named Vanport, as it was positioned midway between Portland and Vancouver, a town on the other side of the Columbia River. The first tenants arrived in Vanport in December 1942, and by late 1943, the number of residents reached 40,000. Of that number, about 6,000 were black, quite a large percentage for Oregon. As a result, Vanport quickly became the second largest city in Oregon. It also was the most prominent black community in the state. As such, Vanport became a thorn in the side of Portland's white community, who believed such a significant number of black people in the area disturbed their preferred way of life. Vanport itself showed mixed attitudes towards racial issues. Vanport was, after all, a segregated town. Blacks were kept in separate areas, away from white folks, and were denied the same medical care as whites. The housing structures in the entire town were pretty bad since it was built in haste. However, the situation in black areas was far worse than in white neighborhoods. Houses designed for blacks were called cardboard palaces. Walls were so thin that occupants had no privacy in their apartments. Even worse, such walls provided no insulation from either heat or cold. Rats, mice, cockroaches, and fleas were common things in flats. Moreover, with a structure consisting of cardboard and wooden blocks, cardboard palaces were very combustible. In black neighborhoods, fires were frequent disturbances. The city of Vanport had many social amenities, but in most of these, blacks were not welcome. Even though it was not forbidden by law, the unofficial policy of town authorities was not to mix races to avoid potential problems. When a group of African Americans organized a dance to collect funds supporting the war effort, they invited a couple of white girls to join. The police shut down the party, fearing reprisals from white citizens. Both blacks and whites were in danger of being arrested if they were found in the wrong part of the city. The only institution where whites and blacks mingled was school. It was only thanks to school superintendent James Hamilton that the school became an example of integration. Pressure to separate white pupils from their black friends was intense, but the superintendent insisted all kids were equal. He even employed black teachers, the first to do so in Oregon. The school had exquisite results during several years of existence and was an excellent opportunity for many young blacks to make a good start in their lives. That was probably the biggest issue in the eyes of authorities, who saw the city of Vanport as a black menace. The rising black community in Vanport became more apparent when the war ended and the shipyard shut down. Many citizens of Vanport moved out, unsatisfied with poor housing and looking for new jobs. In 1945, the number of inhabitants reduced from 40,000 to just 18,500. Most of the people who moved out were whites, thus increasing the portion of the black population to 1/3. The blacks too would have left the deteriorating town if they could. However, the Housing Authority of Portland stuck to the redlining policy and didn't allow the blacks to settle outside Albina and the black areas of Vanport. Then came 1948 and the Great Flood. That year, a snowy winter covered nearby mountains with a thick layer of snow. A relatively cold spring prevented snow from melting gradually, but in May, that changed quickly. The combination of warm weather that caused the snow to quickly melt and unusually heavy rains caused the Columbia River water level to reach dangerous heights. The entire river basin was in danger of being flooded, especially the city of Vanport. Vanport was built on marshland, and the only thing that protected it from the river was a system of 15 to 25-foot tall dikes. On May 30th, 1948, the water level became so high that it threatened to overflow the dike crest. As a precautionary measure, the Army Corps of Engineers was brought in to monitor the situation and react in case of a calamity. As it later turned out, everything pointed to imminent disaster, but the authorities assured everything was in perfect order. The Housing Authority of Portland issued a proclamation to all citizens. Remember, dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited. The truth was, the Housing Authority of Portland was aware a flood was about to happen, as the night before, they packed all of their files from the Vanport office and walked off. They intentionally neglected the safety of the entire city. At 4:17 p.m., a dike near the railroad gave way to the pressure of heavy water flow. Water started to stream through a 6-foot gap that quickly expanded to 500 feet. As soon as the water broke through the dike, a siren sounded a warning. Just a few minutes later, water reached the first houses. Citizens evacuated their homes and ran for their lives. Those who had cars tried to evacuate via the road that connected Vanport to Portland, but eventually abandoned their vehicles as the road clogged. Those who were caught by surprise saved themselves by climbing to the rooftops of their houses. After an hour, everything was over. The water covered the entire town. 15 people died, while 18,000 people lost their homes for good. When the water withdrew on June 23rd, it left nothing but desolation in Vanport. Thousands of people had to look for new homes. However, this was close to impossible for blacks, as the redlining policy was still in force. Fortunately, many white families from Portland opened their houses for black victims, announcing some better times to come. The flood exposed the omnipresent racism of the time. Even though a federal court decided in 1952 that no one was to be blamed for the disaster, it was evident that the racist attitude of the authorities toward the black community in Vanport caused the improper reaction in dealing with the flood. The black community in Portland reacted. They accused the Housing Authority of Portland of deliberately withholding warnings and hiding the actual number of casualties. They pressured the city institutions to finally abandon redlining policy and solve the housing issue for Black families. The city responded and launched a campaign to find food and housing for everyone who lost their homes, including Black families. The image of Portland as a white city, however, didn't change for decades. 20 years after the Vanport flood, 80% of Blacks in Portland still live in Albina. The roots of redlining were difficult to weed out. As for the City of Vanport, the largest Black community in Oregon, they erased it from the map for good. The town was never reconstructed. Instead, a beautiful public park complex was erected, adding to the city's attractiveness. A perfect cover to mask the ugly past of Portland and Oregon. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.